So some of you are just joining me and you missed out on the first part of this. I'm human, what can I say? Nobody reminded me. So anyway, if we're getting compensation from the listing broker, then you would need the cooperating broker compensation agreement. And if you were using the disclosure of buyer agency, I believe is what it was called, you don't want to use that. That's an agreement that was from 2014 and didn't apply to what we're working with today. So wipe that thing out. It's really no longer viable, is the way I would put it, because it dealt with the offer of compensation through the MLS. Okay, so I won't go into too much more than that. So that was one of the first things that had really come up this past week, was really understanding when do we need the cooperating broker compensation agreement. Again, the only time we need that is when we're collecting our compensation from the listing broker. Now let me just check the chat, see if anybody's.
Hey, Darwin,
Yes.
question. If you contact the listing broker to confirm the commission and they tell you, or you ask them, is the seller paying the compensation or is the listing broker? And they say listing broker, then you would tell them that you're sending the co-op broker commission agreement and ask that they sign it. And if they don't, by the time you're writing your offer, then you would then click compensation number 2, compensation being, well, that's a question because it says listing broker, see cooperating broker compensation. So they told you verbally, but then they never returned your form with a signature. So what do you do in a case like that? Would you, I don't know if you could check both seller and listing broker, or you would just take it back and leave it up to the seller?
An individual who will be left unnamed just went, see. Yeah, so here's where we want to leave this. We're really talking about how will we be paid. Now, if we simplify, is the buyer going to want to pay us directly out of pocket? They want to pull that 3% out of pocket. Most of them aren't. Okay. And by the way, we're talking that there are people that could do it. I was talking with one agent this past week where they've got $1 million plus property paying cash. Now, does it really matter whether or not they put it into the purchase price or if the buyer pays it? No, it really doesn't matter. Matter of fact, it might be cheaper for them to pay it out of pocket. Okay. We're simply, where is it going to come from? Now, with that scenario, Brenda, you gave a great example as to why we are probably going to guide a buyer into making their offer, asking the seller to pay compensation. Okay? Because now we just eliminated everything that you just talked about. And even to the point, let me take it to this, we call the listing broker and the listing broker says, nope, I'm offering 0. Or the seller is not offering any compensation. Really, that's what it is. It doesn't really matter to the offer because my buyer can simply put it into the purchase agreement, checking seller who shall contribute 3% of the purchase price to be applied toward buyer broker fee. Okay. Now let's go back to your scenario. I call, the agent says, yes, we are. I prepare my offer and I can't get that form signed. We need to get the offer submitted. I have no agreement with the listing broker now. So what might be the easiest thing to do at that point? Change the purchase agreement you prepared, having now the seller pay the buyer broker compensation, because I have no written agreement between the listing broker and I as the buyer's broker. I have no listing or no agreement for that to be paid. So gang, it's what we're saying, what we're seeing, what I'm hearing from everyone. We probably just want to guide our buyer into putting it into the purchase agreement, them knowing in advance, and simply checking seller.
Darwin,
Yes,
can I add something?
please,
I didn't
sir.
want to disappoint. I didn't want to disappoint you. I, I had this on a recent transaction, even though I got the broker compensation signed in an addendum when we had to make some corrections on something. It was also written out in the addendum. But where I was going with my original question, if somebody doesn't get a buyer's broker compensation form signed, could it not be put right into, I don't know if it's number 3845 of the purchase agreement where it says other, and you put right in there that broker is to pay buy-in agent 3%?
Or Larry, you could check this
Yeah.
box. And so guys, that's where I want, you see, we've been.
What box? Because
Right. So
if
right
they're
here.
not signing,
No,
okay,
no.
yeah, but that's the seller. But
Correct.
if the listing brokers,
I got you. So Larry, say what
okay,
you would have put into that paragraph.
what would I put in there?
Yeah,
Listing
with what you're
listing,
thinking.
that's part of the agreement. The listing broker agrees to pay the cooperating broker compensation of X amount of percent.
Okay, so thank you for bringing that up because there's many people that are thinking that. So to answer that question, could we do that? The answer is yes. But who are the parties to that purchase agreement? The answer?
The seller.
And the
Buyer.
So where has the listing broker agreed to pay the compensation?
I don't know.
I can only do that with you, my friend. Yeah,
I know.
So what we have to understand with all of this is that the purchase agreement is an agreement between the buyer and seller. So when it comes to compensation being paid by a listing broker, we have to have the cooperating broker compensation agreement. So Larry, what I would suggest, and this is where I've always got to take and resist answering your question before you finish it, is that we just keep it simple because you want to put it on the purchase agreement. Instead of it coming from the listing broker, we simply go to paragraph 5 and check off seller. We're accomplishing the same thing with a whole lot more simplicity, a lot less trouble, hassle. And oh, by the way, don't forget about trying to get paid at the time of closing, because if it says the listing broker is to pay it, where do you and how do you do that? Because you can't have the seller paying it because that should have been on a purchase agreement. So reality, guys, don't try to understand if it doesn't make sense, but think of a closing statement. What it would have to show when a listing broker is paying it is the listing broker paying it. So it would have been, let's say, we sign a listing agreement with a seller that we get 6% and we're going to offer 3%. Well, at the time of closing, on the seller's closing statement would have showed that we got 6%. Outside of the closing, we would be handing off a check for 3% to the listing broker, because that's the way it needs to be done to live up to and fulfill all of the paperwork as it is written. So again, coming back to it, what's the simplest way for us to be able to get our compensation? And the way that we could guide a buyer is buyer. What we found is the easiest way to do it is to have the 3% that's been offered, asking the seller to pay that.
Darwin?
Yes, sir.
First of all, I would like to say that the way you explained that just now cleared up every question I've had for you in the past 3 or 4 weeks. That explanation was perfect. Could you write that down and put it in gold and email it to all of us? Second, there was a red flag when Larry just gave his explanation, and the red flag was, what if we don't have a buyer agency agreement signed?
Ouch, right? So what if we don't have the buyer agency agreement signed? One, we're in violation of the terms of the settlement. We're violating the terms of the settlement. We haven't broken the law. Two, you won't get paid. So, you've heard me say it, the lack of a contract is the same as having a contract signed with a zero or a blank. And again, just a reminder, everybody, think of anybody you may be working with as a buyer. What does the buyer representation contract have in regards to your compensation? If you left it blank, if you put in a zero, if you put a dash through it, that's exactly how much you get paid. You cannot take more than what is on that buyer representation contract. Okay, so that's a key part. All right.
Darwin,
Let me see if I got Jeff here first, boss. Did I answer both of them, Jeff?
I'm good.
All right. All right. Let's go to Brenda.
what you just did? You just reiterated the fact that the PA rules.
You're absolutely right.
And that PA is between the buyer and the seller. It has nothing to do with the listing or the buyer's broker. It's between those two individuals.
That's it. That's it. And therefore, now hear my words. We can't negotiate our compensation as part of the purchase agreement. However, the buyer, as part of their purchase agreement, can request that a seller pay that compensation. The buyer, as part of their offer, can do that. Well, because we've done that agreement prior to, we've explained how we can get compensated, how much we get compensated. We can help the buyer understand the simplicity is to simply build it into the purchase agreement. Okay.
All right, let me add something. Like I
Yes,
said,
sir.
I got this, he put it into an addendum. And I'm just saying that if you have not received the broker compensation from the listing agent back and you want to submit the offer, in this particular addendum that the listing agent wrote out, he made that a contingency that the seller agrees to pay X amount commission, X amount goes to the listing broker, X amount goes to the selling broker, the buyer's broker. And that's how it was spelled out.
Yeah. So where you were going is where I went, I know where you're going. And that would be having it as a contingency that the seller if we're making it contingent upon the seller paying it, we don't need an addendum. We just need to check, we'll call it 5A. Okay. Seller who shall contribute. We don't need to do it any other way. Keep it simple, check the box, put 3. Okay. In the event, Larry, that you brought up, our scenario, I should say, that was brought up, where I can't get the cooperating broker compensation agreement, the buyer could make the offer contingent upon listing broker signing a cooperating compensation agreement. So you could do it that way in that event, but what would be simplest? Get it from the seller. See, everything that we keep doing, and this is why I keep going, what's the simplest way to do it? Just get it from the seller. Because in reality, if we take a mindset or a mentality, and maybe the term would be attitude even, the seller's authorizing that compensation. Isn't the seller paying it anyway? So
Yes,
if the
but he's
seller's
off.
authorizing it, let's put it right into the purchase agreement.
But they're authorizing it to the listing broker, not to you.
Oh, are they?
Yeah.
Hey, listen, so gang, here's the simple part. Here, let's keep it really simple. It's up to you. Do you want to make it difficult? Get it from the listing broker. Want to keep it simple? Get it from the seller. I really don't care. I just like things really easy. And that's why you're going to see, matter of fact, you're going to see most of the offers that you're going to get when people start to figure this out. They're just going to put it in the offer, having the seller pay it. Because see, whether or not the seller gives 6% to the listing broker and the listing broker pays us the 3%, or if the seller pays the listing broker 3% and pays us 3%, the last I knew, 3 and 3 is still 6. It's just a matter of paper flow. And it will be a lot easier when it comes to closing statements, because with the way our purchase agreement is now written, here's the way that I foresee us getting our closing statements taken care of. It would show, with the seller paying it, it would show this. A debit to the seller, giving a credit to the buyer. On the buyer's closing statement, it would show a debit paying us as the buyer broker. Clearly making it what the whole settlement was about anyway, is that the buyer's paying it. They didn't want sellers to pay it, but they simply haven't thought about real estate and how it works. So we're giving them what they want in regards to the flow of the paperwork, but the reality, we're still dealing with the same 6%. So yeah, guys, in the end, you can do it either way. And yeah, I'm going to keep it simple for right now. I won't complicate it. If somebody's offering 2 and you've got a contract for 3, doesn't matter, buyer, 3%. There's no sense in me trying to negotiate with a listing broker to pay me 3% when they've got a seller who's only authorized 2. I get 3% if I'm negotiating it. I've already negotiated with the buyer. Okay, so we'll be clear with that. I get 3%. The buyer then is negotiating with the seller to get the 3% paid.
So in that case, Darwin, are we checking more than one box here?
That's what I was trying to stay away from. So the answer, I think that was Kevin.
Yeah.
Kevin, the answer would be directly yes. However, instead of getting 2 from the seller, well, no, let me rephrase that. Instead of getting 2 from the listing broker and having to deal with that and then 1 from the seller, why not put all 3% to the purchase agreement to the seller?
I guess what I was thinking was more put, if we know that they're only offering 2%, are we checking the buyer box that they're going to check that they're going to pay the extra 1% out of there, or are we just putting all 3 in their seller and start the negotiations?
I would go with the second one.
Okay.
Because, and think about it from this direction, Kevin, is the buyer still paying that 3%? See, they could negotiate the 2% that's already offered,
Right.
and then pay the 1% out of their pocket.
Okay.
Or they could offer the seller enough to pay all 3%.
Got it. Okay.
So, you know, again, we're going to do whatever is under the direction of the buyer, but you're the one who's consulting them. It would be simplest to have all 3% into the purchase agreement. And of course, what many of you heard me talk about last week, don't, Mr. Broker, well, let me rephrase that. Mr. or Mrs. Listing Broker, don't negotiate my compensation. The buyer needs that. They need that to be paid. So they owe me 3%. I know that you're offering 2, it doesn't matter. So if you have to reject the offer because it doesn't work for them, reject the offer and make a counter offer by increasing the price. But the buyer owes me 3%. So whether you do it there, I got to pull it out of their pocket, doesn't matter, except for they haven't got it to pull out of their pocket. That's most buyers.
Okay.
So, and this is going to be a bit of negotiating and skills that we've got to get, educating not only ourselves and building our own skills and knowledge, but that of agents on the other side.
That's exactly what I was thinking, but we're being very well prepared right now, but we're going to come up against some knuckleheads. And I'm
Yes.
thinking that if I'm sitting down with my buyer on section number 5, I'm going to tell her to check the first one with the seller, but then she may ask me, well, how come there's a one there for listing broker? Why is that there? What do I tell her?
Well, that's where probably prior to the purchase agreement, remember that we've had a buyer interview and we've negotiated our compensation, and we probably gave them recent history where it was really the listing broker who's always compensated us. However, with recent developments through a class action lawsuit against us, they've now required us to be able to do it this different way. And we're finding the simplest way is not to get it from the listing broker as we used to do, but rather that we build it into the purchase agreement and hit it that way.
Darren, Scott here. If we build it into the purchase agreement, do we then check 5C?
Well, that's a great question, but not 5C, because I would say, to answer your question, who's paying the compensation? Who are you asking to pay the compensation?
Well, by raising the price that at 3%, then the buyer, that's why we're doing it. So the buyer can
Right.
pay the agent.
So now black and white, when it comes to the paperwork, who's paying the compensation?
The listing broker. Ultimately.
Who are you asking? So by the way, that could be, but well, I'm going to give the answer by asking this. If the buyer is asking the seller to pay the full compensation, then who's paying the compensation?
The seller.
And you just gave the answer to your question.
Did I? I'm smarter than I think.
That's all right, Scott. Yeah, so here's, and by the way, this happened earlier here in Fenton, we were talking about similar. And so what we're looking at is we're going, well, the buyer increased the price so that really they're paying it. Well, really? They are. But when it comes to the paperwork, who's paying it? You're asking the seller to pay it. Yep, maybe. And by the way, I'm going to do this. That means it's fictitious in this case. The seller built or added on to the purchase price. Or the buyer did. Matter of fact, if there's a counteroffer, it could be the seller is doing it. Right? So
Right.
in the end, there's a purchase agreement, and the buyer and seller come to an agreement on a price. And what we want them to do is come to an agreement on a price that pays us the full compensation. In which case, where we're at right now, what we keep talking about, the simplest way is to have the seller pay it as part of the paperwork, in this case, the purchase agreement, right there. So then, again, who's paying it? When we say the buyer is asking the seller, it's the seller
Darwin,
paying it. Okay?
Darwin.
Yes.
So it seems to me, yes, it is simpler, but we are relying on the listing agent to explain to their seller, yes, you listed it for 6%, and it's not additive, the seller paying the 3%.
Yep. You are correct. And that's why I say it's going to take a bit, but up front, most of us already know. And here, again, I've got to throw it out. There's got to be smart enough sellers to realize that I'm not paying you 6% and then paying them 3%, or asking that question. Now, are there some unethical, uncouth real estate agents who will go, well, gee, I got an opportunity to keep all 6 and have the seller pay an additional 3 for the buyers. Absolutely. But we were just talking right when we wrapped up here in Fenton. We have an agent in here who got a listing. Agent calls our listing agent, says, are you offering compensation? Yes, we're offering 3%. The buyer submits an offer. The listing forwards that submission to our agent, our listing agent. There's nothing on the purchase agreement about buyer broker compensation. There's no cooperating broker compensation agreement. Does that buyer's broker get paid? Well, as long as they signed a buyer representation agreement. But literally what we would have to do is to get clarification now from the buyer's agent. So listen, you didn't send me a cooperating agreement for compensation. You don't have it on the purchase agreement, so your buyer's paying you directly. But yeah, let that one soak in. Because technically, we don't have to compensate that agent. Technically, we don't have to compensate that agent. I don't think that we can necessarily assume that the agent made a mistake. They may have made an offer and the buyer's going to pay them out of pocket. But we do need clarification. And as a company, being who we are, ethical as we are, and they said, oops, I made a mistake, but we still offer that 3 or pay that 3, I'm sure that we would. But let's not be that agent that finds herself in that situation. So yeah, you're absolutely right, guys. And you know, I've said it quite a lot, is that, again, we're going to have to educate everybody else because we're one of the few that actually know it. No, by the way, our purchase agreement is way ahead of everybody else, because what I've been seeing with purchase agreements that I've been reviewing, there are additional conditions. Seller to pay buyer broker fee of blank %. Well, that's the way most are already coming in, because everybody's seeing that as a simplicity. And don't forget, you have brokers that will not pay compensation. The seller has authorized compensation, but the broker is saying, I won't pay it. So you want that 3% that they've authorized me to promote? No problem. Buyer has to put it on their purchase agreement. Okay, so that's—
Does the agent get to keep the 6%?
We're not going to do that.
Okay.
But technically, could they? Gosh, I just don't know how I could do it, but it's going to depend upon how their agreement is written. Ours is written in such a way that you're authorized, you're going to pay us 6 and authorize us take 3 of that 6 and offer it to the buyer broker. It's for procuring the buyer. Okay, so even for ourselves, if we double dip or it's in-house, it's 3% for each side. So as I was sharing earlier, again, a change in mindset is not that we're paying it. The sellers authorized us to offer that compensation. So it really is, how is it written in regards to their listing agreement? Okay, but I think we need to carry that mindset that says it's the seller who's offering the compensation. Whether they pay us 6, I think it's better that we look at it this way. We get our 3 and they're authorizing us to offer 3. That's the way that we'll see it. Okay, great question.
Okay. Are you ready for me, Darwin?
Let's bring it on, buddy.
Okay. Buyer agent can't receive more than the buyer agent contract says.
Correct.
So that eliminates agent bonuses that we used to see back in the day.
Yes.
Or that bonus could be given to the buyer, not the agent.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how it would handle it. So if a seller's actually wanting to offer a bonus, they're trying to, let's interpret this, they're trying to make their property more marketable.
Right.
If they were to say, I don't know, offer an additional 1%, where might that be better used?
Closing costs.
So closing cost, taxes, prepaids, otherwise, paragraph 6, seller concessions. So it might be that we then promote that there's also 1% being authorized towards seller concessions. Now, what's the other thing that you're saying? We'll take 1% less if you don't need these concessions. So I think, and so Jeff, I have that in this PowerPoint that we'll probably never get to today, but I think it would be thinking from a point of marketability, which even offering a bonus as an incentive to a buyer's agent. Reality, how else could we use that 1%? Where would it make it more marketable because we offered it? So is that closing cost, taxes, prepaids? Is it, gosh, maybe it's instead of listing at 210, we list it at 208. I mean, just to use some simple numbers. Might it make it more marketable, or where can I apply that to make it more marketable? And oh, by the way, I don't know that giving a $2,000 carpet allowance makes sense. It probably won't fly with a mortgage company because it would have to go in prior to closing. That's a simple thing, but talk to your managers on that one. I got a question here.
Well, that was a Bob Kennedy question. Then I have a question, a question for me.
Oh,
and
sure, Jeff. Blame it on Bob.
No, I want to make sure that he gets credit for that good question because I didn't.
Yeah, that is a great question.
All
It's a
right, so
very
my
great question.
question is, I have buyers who are, VA, FHA, they don't have a lot of money put down. They can't guarantee me 3%. So I'm entering into a buyer agency contract with them and I'm like, okay, I'm going to be a great agent and we'll put 2% in there. Okay, if the seller is offering 3%, I can only get 2% because that's what my contract says. Or do I change that contract to say 3% so I collect my full 3%?
Did I get lost on that one?
Maybe.
Did you have it in at 3 and oh, no, okay. So what you're saying is what if I sign one for 2%?
Correct.
And the 3% is offered?
Correct.
Yes. So I know Jeff is getting these questions, and actually it's pretty reasonable. So in the case where I get an offer that's more than I signed,
Correct.
I do need to have my buyer agreement changed. Okay, but I ask you this, and again, I know, Jeff, why you're throwing this out. As a buyer, why would I say, sure, I'll pay you 1 more %? I mean, $300,000 house, that's $3,000. If the seller was offering that, but you've only signed for 2, why would I want to pay you? Wouldn't I save more money by just taking the 2% that you've already signed up for and negotiating lower? So I mean, the answer to the question, guys, and this one's come up before, yes, you can amend the agreement that you signed going from 2 to 3, as long as the buyer will sign that amendment.
Okay,
to the buyer representation contract.
So that brings up a good question when we're negotiating the buyer agency contract with the buyer at the very beginning, and they're like, well, we can't offer you 3%, we can offer you 2%. And you say, okay, well, can we put in the contract that you will guarantee me 2%, but if I get 3, you'll let me have the 3. Do it at the beginning instead of swapping it when we have an offer.
I am like 99% certain that would be no. And the reason being is that it has to be a specific determinable amount. So that gives a matter of fact, let me give you a different scenario that we have used in the past. This is no longer viable. Can't do this. But what we might do is to say that I will take 3% and whatever is, or here, we will accept the amount offered through the MLS compensation, provided said amount is not less than 3%. So it's 3% or whatever I can get. We can't do that. So I'm 100%. Yeah, you couldn't do that. Could not do that.
Darwin, I have a question pertaining to what Jeff just asked.
Mhm.
In our exclusive buyer agreement, the paragraph just below that it says that the buyer will be credited any amounts paid for by the seller. So when Jeff's example was, okay, we agree with 2% or 2.5%, and then the home that we're gonna write on, the homeowner is offering 3%. Then if the buyer knows that they're gonna be credited whatever amounts are being paid for by the seller, then why would they be reluctant not to sign a new agreement indicating 3% as opposed to the initially agreed upon 2 or 2.5%? They're not paying it. The seller is paying it. So
so yeah, really, it's a great question, you guys. And what I would say is black and white, the seller's paying it. But if the seller didn't have to pay that, call it $3,000, would the buyer be able to offer less? Say about $3,000. Because what we're talking about in reality, we don't negotiate on the purchase price, we negotiate on the bottom line. So the buyer figuratively should save $3,000 because the listing broker well, here it is again. We don't know what the listing broker's contract says. Let's say they're offering the 3. Are they going to keep 4 because you only signed for 2? So when I come down to it, I'm sitting here thinking a way that we would probably operate. But the reality is we don't know how anybody on the other side is going to operate. But figuratively, a broker, well, here, I'm going to say not code of ethics, but ethically, if I signed up for 6 knowing that I was really getting 3 and we were offering 3, but I only have to pay 2, meaning the listing or the seller, why should you now get 4? But listen, there may be contracts written in such a way that it allows that. I don't know. So great question. I guess it's the aspect of let's make great presentations to buyers selling our value to where they want to pay you more than 3%. Hopefully I gave you a good enough answer that you can live with it, but bottom line, it still comes to the buyer. It's up to them, but yes, we would be required to amend our buyer representation contract to accept more than what we have written.
Okay, so now if we're listing a property, can we list it for 3%? As long as our seller knows that they're probably going to be paying the buyer, they might be paying the buyer 3%. Because
Yeah.
lots of people are biting to ask this question.
So actually a great one, Jeff. So here's what we know. I believe all of us feel this way, that the property will be more marketable when compensation is offered. Because many of us believe that, well, if I call matter of fact, I've even heard a couple of stories where a listing has been on the market for weeks. It's funny to say that, and it hasn't sold yet. And amazingly common that there was no offer of compensation. So our belief that a property is more marketable when compensation is offered, I think is starting to be proven. So to answer then the question with all of that directly, the answer is, could we list a property for 3 and offer no compensation? Absolutely. As a matter of fact, I would feel confident saying, look, I charge 3%. The only question is what do you want me to promote as the offer of compensation for a buyer's broker? It's really what we're doing. But here's the key. Remember this. So here's another scenario. It's come up a few times, came up today. If I sign a buyer, if I sign a seller up, 3% for me as a listing broker and 0 offer of compensation. Now I hold the house open. A buyer comes in from Timbuktu, don't know him from a hill of beans, says, I love this house. Can you write it up? I'm hoping you're processing that right now. Because what's your offer of compensation? You've worked with the buyer, but there's no offer of compensation for the buyer. Well, then why don't I, because here's where it went. Well, why don't I sign them up for a buyer representation agreement where they got to pay me? Oh, do you think that was really in the best interest of your seller to add 3% more into the expenses? Because you had that seller already. So listen, I will throw this out. Will I and should we take a listing where it's 3% for us and 0% offer of compensation? Look, as long as you got the right terms, yes. The property is going to sell. Seller might actually net less, but yeah, let's take the listing. Problem is that scenario that I created where you might have the double dip. But even though you have a double dip, you only get 3%. So think about that one when it comes to a seller who says, I don't want to offer compensation. You may not want to hold an open house. Maybe somebody else does. Then they can sign up the buyer and get the contract signed for the buyer representation.
One of the reasons I asked this question is because looking at properties yesterday, I saw several listings that said 3% or in the remarks, it's, I don't remember how it was worded, but there was no compensation offered to the buyer's agent, had to be negotiated through the purchase agreement. So it was a 3% listing.
Yeah, so there shouldn't be anything in the MLS regarding buyer broker compensation at all.
You're right, but it was there. I saw it.
Yeah. So, yeah, now there should be nothing. Real comp, I can tell you, they've got it automatically programmed. There are bad words.
Yes, we have them posted at the office. All the offices should have them. And if anybody needs them, I'll be more than happy to get them to them.
Yeah, so they sent them out with, here's the bad words, and then they had to send something out, and actually I've got that in here somewhere too, where there were words such as bonus. It was a word and you couldn't use it. It got flagged. You couldn't put it into the listing. When in reality, you're trying to put in that there's a bonus room. Well, you couldn't use the term bonus room because it was a flagged word. Well, they've realized that, okay, well, that can't be just a word that won't even be used, but it gets flagged to see how it's used. So Real Comp is definitely up to that. I don't know that the other MLSs are programmed to be able to use, we'll call it AI, to determine those words and flag them and wipe them out or anything of that nature. But yeah, we have to be watchful of any of that and be prepared, because there are going to be agents who are offering 0. And we talked last week that there's brokers and agents that are going, well, I don't want to tip my hat. I don't want to tell you that we're offering compensation. Well, are you really doing what's in the best interest of your seller? They believe they are, but I think the real question is, are you? Is the property as marketable when you do that? Yeah, you're not tipping your hats in regards to negotiation, but you might not have to negotiate because you got no offer. How many people are going, well, there's no offer of compensation. we're thinking buyers are going to say, don't even show me that property. How many of them are thinking like us, where it's like, I don't care if you're offering it or not. I'm going to show it. If you like it, we'll build it in. What's the worst thing that happens? We can't get a contract negotiated with the seller paying my compensation. Okay, move on. Next. All right, great questions, you guys. This is awesome. I love this. What else you got? Anything else there? Otherwise, I'm going to check my chat box here and see what else might came in. Oh, let's see. Yep, that's good. Yes. Oh, you know what? That's actually, Kevin, you didn't ask it directly this way, but this has been a question. You've got, what's the difference between collecting from the listing broker and collecting from the seller? Are they the same thing? Well, here, I threw this out earlier. When you combine black and white, what do you get? Gray. So when you combine the black and white, you get gray. So looking at it from the gray direction, the answer to your question is yes. But when you leave black and white separate, they are two separate entities. And the buyer representation contract even addresses it. Jeff just brought that out. It says that any monies collected either from the listing broker or the seller. I don't know if he needs help, but he was just about to come in and but it says any monies collected from the seller or the seller's broker will be credited toward the amount you owe me. They have to be separate because we're talking about where is it going to show, who is it going to show is paying the compensation. That will clarify where we need agreement from. So if it says seller, we need it from the seller. If it's coming from the buyer, we got a buyer representation contract. If it says that it's coming from the listing broker, then we've got to have that cooperating compensation agreement. Okay. Agents are telling me the buyer broker commission is negotiable. This is a great one, actually. If anybody's been out there and anybody's paying attention, haven't lived under a rock, back when the settlement was first agreed upon and announced, everybody got educated really quickly, right? So agents are telling me that the buyer broker commission is negotiable. It is. It is. I negotiate with my buyer. You negotiate with your buyer. But once I've negotiated with my buyer, it's no longer negotiable. I mean, again, I hate to keep saying KISS because it's like wearing out, but we have to keep it simple. I've negotiated with my buyer. Somebody else has theirs. They should have already negotiated with their buyer. There's no more negotiating my commission. My buyer needs this paid. They've signed a contract to see that I get paid this amount. It's going to be in there. Okay. So, yeah, we're going to keep it simple. The seller's going to pay. Did I say knucklehead, Jeff? Was that what? Oh, I love that. All right. What do you do when a listing agent ghosts you? Oh, Jason, it's a great question again. This happened to me, called, text, the agent several times, even tried his broker who wouldn't respond. Are you ready for this? Jason, it doesn't matter. I'm going to advise my buyer. Here's everything I've done to find out what the offer of compensation is. I can't get it from them. And therefore, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, we don't have any other option. Now with me, they're already prepared. They know we're going to put it on a purchase agreement. What are you now going to do with it, Jason? Put it on a purchase agreement. You've already negotiated with the buyer. They owe you 3%. We just could, the simplicity is we couldn't find out what was offered. But again, doesn't matter. You want to get me paid, we're going to build it into the transaction by asking the seller to pay it. Okay? Hopefully that one takes care of that. And by the way, that's a great example of why we should just educate the buyer, put it into their purchase agreement, asking the seller to pay it, because that's the type of stuff that we are running into. So just one more shared that it lands that way. Let's see. I'm anticipating receiving a purchase agreement. That is clear and thorough as ours. You're absolutely right. If we are offering 3% cooperating compensation to buyer's broker in the purchase agreement we receive is asking the seller to pay the 3%, but does not have the verbiage that explains the amount offered as cooperating compensation. Do we need to add any verbiage? I'll tell you the ones that I've seen. So it's going to depend upon what the verbiage is. It could be as simple as this: seller to pay 3%. However, does that leave it open for interpretation? My thought is yes, and that's why I would always like it to say seller to pay 3% of purchase price to be applied toward buyer broker fee. Yeah, I think it's bring the clarity. I've never been before any, what do I say, arbitration panel or any other panel. I've never been brought up on anything. And I believe the reason being is that I'm very careful in answering all the what ifs, and we're bringing clarity to anything that needs it without sounding like an attorney that comes up with that. Yeah, depending upon the verbiage, you may have to actually counter. So Valerie, great question with that one. Ethically, we're going to follow up with the BA, the buyer's agent, who's missing, I'm going to say missing the address of the buyer broker compensation. So not only that they don't have a compensation agreement that they forwarded, but that they didn't put it on the purchase agreement, because that only leaves us then to believe that the buyer is going to compensate them directly out of pocket. So to avoid any confusion and any hassles that come along later, because they're under because I could see this happening. I got Schmo over there at Losers Realty, and Schmo's never been educated, doesn't have the agreements that they should have. And I believe this is out there, right? And he doesn't know any better. And let's say he called Logan, and Logan says, yeah, we're offering compensation, but he didn't send a compensation agreement. He didn't put it on the purchase agreement, but he didn't know any better. So yeah, let's definitely, I would just say, even out of our own ethics, call and get that clarification so that we can avoid any issues that could come up later. And see how it's to be handled, and do that before we even negotiate the purchase agreement. Because again, if he actually was expecting that 3%, well, let's pay it, but let's get some certainty to that. And so Jamie put it here, I don't even ask, I write the offer with 3% from the listing broker that it will be willing to negotiate. I write the offer with 3% from the listing broker. Oh, that you might negotiate that 3%. And Jamie, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I know where you're going with this. I'm going to write the 3%, and we negotiate, and we get down to the point where we're $1,000 apart. Might I, on a $300,000 listing, give $500? Yeah. So I think that's kind of where you're going with that, Jamie, if I'm right. But we're not going to negotiate that up front. We're going to let the seller and the buyer negotiate the terms of the agreement with knowing that 3% is there. And when they get so close, it might be a good business decision for me to just go ahead and offer 500 of my compensation as an example. Okay, I like that. Are you guys got questions in Sterling Heights, or are you just waving hi?
Yes, waiting for 10 minutes.
Oh, no problem.
Darwin.
Good thing I looked down at that point, you guys.
Yeah, this is there is a listing agent, new list. I'm sorry, there's a new listing today. It's saying at the bottom, seller concession invite, yes, 3%. Seller might consider buyer concession if buyer submits the concession in the purchase agreement. What do you want to say about it?
They're going to get their hand slapped as soon as the MLS finds out about that. Because they're, what's that?
It's in the MLS.
Yeah, the MLS, literally, Sam, what we should probably do is to notify my real source that this is in the MLS, because we need to protect ourselves and the MLS. Because that's a direct violation of the agreement that we have through this settlement. So they're in violation, and guys, I don't want to call it narking on them. We're not tattletales. Maybe they're not aware of it. Now, if they're doing it intentionally, well, then yeah, they deserve to have their hands slapped. But I think up front, they may not know that they can't do that. Okay. Real comp, I'm quite certain that with their restricted words, it wouldn't even show up. Great question.
Another thing is out of the commission. I don't know if you are familiar today from the MLS saying, come learn about the mobile apps. Maybe you or Scott knows something or is going to know something about as of today. Is something to be in Paragon Connect for the showing on simple showing time, something like this. If you click on MLS, you're gonna see it in the first page.
Yeah.
Agent, what you need to know is to go on August 28th at 10 o'clock till 11:30.
If I'm hearing you right, is the question that can we post the offer of compensation as example in showing time? Or in?
Is that? Yeah, on showing time, yeah.
Okay, the answer would be, I'm gonna say it's about 90% no. It could not be done, and the reason being is that they're considered that as promoting the offer of compensation as part of the MLS. So because showing time is through the MLS, it's, again, I'm 90% certain, and the only reason I leave that 10% window is because I've thrown some scenarios where I believe it's not promoting. But I did talk to a director of the Board of Governors and they were saying, no, you cannot, because that would fall under the offering compensation in the MLS. I mean, that was the short answer to that. So we can negotiate, we can promote it anywhere outside of the MLS, as long as it's not in an aggregate third-party source. So that's where we need to get our Moxie websites up, because those will be the amounts of compensation can be put there. Obviously, you guys can put them in your in back at you media. That has a section to be able to put it in there for your listings. And so we can also, through Moxie, then that will go to our brand websites. Now I say brand, that would be Coldwell Banker Professionals, that would be Century 21 AAA North, Century 21 Row, Town and Country. It would be those individual company websites that we can put it on there. Okay. Wow, I don't see any other questions. And guys, I got to tell you, I thought I might be able to keep this to 45 minutes, but you guys have had great questions. And I haven't even addressed everything that has come up this week. But we've hit a lot. So here's what we need to make note of. It's going to be no hot topic next week. We are off next week. That's a day after Labor Day. So everybody enjoy the weekend, or if you're, decided to take this week and you still join me, or if you're on vacation next week like I am. Be safe and enjoy it. Stay up on everything that's going on. As always, we always talk real estate. So when we get back, I'm sure we're gonna have more questions and we'll get more answers. And you guys know I'm a phone call away. So with that, I'm gonna bid you adieu. Another wrap up to a Hot Topic Tuesday. See you in a couple of weeks, guys. Have a great one. Yeah, I'll tell you.